The parking lot of the Hardin County Food Mart was half empty on a Tuesday morning in November, and the woman was almost to the door of a white Ford when the dog stepped in front of her. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply moved from the sidewalk to the space between the woman and the car door and sat down, square and immovable, the way a dog sits when it has made a decision and is not inviting discussion. The woman stopped. She looked at him. She said something quiet that the man at the far end of the lot couldn't hear. And then she put her hand on the dog's head, not in fear, not to push him away, but with the particular tenderness of someone who has always known how to touch a dog, as though this were natural, as though she had done this 10,000 times before. The man's coffee hit the pavement before he understood why his hand had let go of it. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and follow it until the very end. Stories like this one are the reason this channel exists, and we want to know how far it travels. Gunnery Sergeant Nathan Hayes, retired, had been standing at the trunk of his truck parked at the far end of the lot, loading groceries when it happened. He was 38 years old and carried that age with the kind of understated solidity that comes from having spent most of his adult life in conditions that stripped away everything optional. He was lean and broad through the shoulders, 6 feet, with dark hair cut short, and a jaw that had been described by a corpsman in Helmand as looking like it was made for getting hit and not caring. His eyes were a deep, steady brown, not warm in the way that invites people in, but honest in the way that makes people trust him anyway. The kind of eyes that had calculated distances and threats and the weight of decisions, and had never pretended otherwise. There were 2 lines across his forehead that had no business being there at 38, except that they did. Because worry puts its marks where it finds room. And Nathan Hayes had been carrying a specific weight for 14 months. He'd done 3 deployments with the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, the 1st to Sangin in Helmand Province, the 2nd to Ramadi, the 3rd a combined arms coordination role in northeastern Syria with a special operations advisory element whose details he had signed documents about and did not discuss. He'd come home from Syria with a Bronze Star with Valor device, a hairline fracture in his right wrist that had healed correctly, and a hearing in his right ear that worked at roughly 70% of what it used to, which was enough. His discharge had come 18 months ago, medical, the wrist and the hearing together clearing the threshold. He lived now in Hardin County, Wyoming, in the house where he'd grown up, which he'd moved back into after his discharge because the alternative had been leaving it empty and it already felt too close to that. His mother, Carol Hayes, had been reported missing 14 months ago. She was 63 years old at the time of her disappearance, 5'4", with silver-brown hair she wore short and a habit of keeping a particular posture, straight-backed and deliberate, that people who knew her recognized immediately. She had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease 2 years before Nathan returned home. She had been living independently, managing well, checking in every Sunday by phone. Then, one Sunday, the phone hadn't rung, and Nathan had driven the 40 miles from the base, where he'd been processing discharge paperwork, and found the house empty. The door unlocked, her coffee still on the counter. He had spent the first week running every search he knew how to run. The sheriff's department had run their own. After 14 months, the file was technically open and functionally inert. Nathan had stopped expecting to find her alive. He had not stopped looking. Kodiak was a 5-year-old German shepherd, with a coat that ran from deep black at the ears and spine to rich mahogany and gold along his flanks and chest, the coloring shifting with the light in a way that made him look different depending on which direction he faced. He weighed 87 pounds. His left foreleg carried a 4-inch scar, where a fragment had opened the muscle during a vehicle approach in Ramadi, healed clean, movement unaffected, fur grown back slightly coarser along the line, in a way that looked like the mark had always been meant to be there. He moved with the level, considered attention of a dog who had worked real environments, and learned the difference between the world's constant noise and the specific register of meaning. In the 2 years since Nathan had navigated the military working dog adoption process, Kodiak had not once reacted to something that turned out to be nothing. Nathan had learned to treat that record as a fact about the world rather than a coincidence about the dog. The November morning was cold, the way Wyoming mornings in November are cold. Not dramatic, just absolute. The kind of cold that doesn't argue with you. The parking lot held maybe a dozen cars, the low gray sky pressing down on the Bighorn foothills visible at the town's edge. Nathan had been loading the last bag when he'd heard Kodiak's nails on the asphalt. The quick, deliberate movement of the dog going somewhere with a specific purpose, and it looked up. The woman had come out of the Food Mart's side entrance, carrying a small paper bag and moving toward the white Ford at the pace of someone who knew where they were going. She was slight and straight-backed, silver-brown hair cut short, wearing a blue fleece jacket over a patterned flannel shirt. Nathan had looked at her the way you look at strangers in a parking lot, briefly and without intention, and then Kodiak had stepped in front of her and sat down, and Nathan had looked again. His hand let go of the coffee. He crossed the parking lot without running, because he had learned long ago that running toward a situation changes the situation before you understand it. Kodiak was still sitting. The woman was still standing. Her hand was still on his head, and she was talking to him in a low voice, the same voice Nathan had heard every morning of his childhood, at every table, in every kitchen, for 32 years before he'd left for boot camp at Parris Island, and she'd stood in the driveway and not cried until he'd turned the corner. "Mom," he said. She looked up. Her face was thinner than he remembered. Her eyes were the same pale gray-green they had always been, and they moved across his face with recognition that wasn't quite complete. Not confusion. Not blankness, but the particular searching quality of someone locating a memory that has been stored somewhere they have to reach for. "I know you," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice was level. It took everything he had to keep it that way. Her name was Carol Ann Hayes. She had been a school teacher in Hardin County for 21 years, 3rd grade, and her former students, now in their 20s and 30s, still brought their own children by her porch in the summers before she got sick. She had raised Nathan alone after his father's death when Nathan was 11, working the school year and taking waitress shifts in the summers, and she had never once made him feel the weight of how hard she was working, which was itself a form of extraordinary discipline. She made lemon pound cake from scratch every Christmas. She had strong opinions about bird feeders and bird seed and the kind of people who filled them with the wrong seed. She had once driven 4 hours in a February ice storm to sit with a former student whose mother had died. And she had not mentioned it for months because she didn't consider it notable. She had been gone for 14 months. How she had come to be in the parking lot of the Hardin County Food Mart on a Tuesday morning in November was a story that took several days and multiple agencies to assemble completely. What emerged was this. 6 weeks after her disappearance, Carol Hayes had been found by a county sheriff's deputy in Borden County, 2 states east, walking along a state highway in early morning. She had been uninjured, lucid in some respects, and confused in others, and had given her name, but not her address. She had been brought to a county care facility in Borden, a private facility operating under contract with the county's social services department, where she had been admitted under the name Carol Hayes, the spelling error compounding an intake process that had failed to run a national missing persons cross-check. She had been there for 13 months. The facility was called Sunrise Residential Care. It was owned by a holding company registered in Delaware with a Wyoming business address that traced back to a man named Gregory Pell, who sat on the Borden County Social Services Advisory Board and had held the county's residential care contract for 7 years. Without competitive rebid, Pell was 61, plausible and well-connected. The kind of man who attended every relevant civic function and whose name appeared on donation lists for 3 local political campaigns. He had known about Carol Hayes' identity discrepancy. A staff member would later testify that she had flagged it in writing at the 6-month mark and had done nothing. The facility collected $1,400 per month from Wyoming Medicaid for Carol's placement. 13 months of uncorrected billing for a woman who had a family looking for her amounted to a specific number that Nathan did not let himself think about in the parking lot, because there were things he needed to do before he let himself think about it. The first thing he did was call 911 and stay on the line while he walked Carol to the bench outside the Food Mart's entrance and sat beside her. She was calm. She held the small paper bag in her lap. It contained a candy bar and a small bottle of orange juice, which she had apparently purchased with coins she'd been carrying. And she looked around the parking lot with the mild, assessing interest of a woman trying to place herself. Kodiak sat at her feet and did not move. "That's a good dog," she said. "He is," Nathan said. "His name is Kodiak." She considered this. That's a good name for him. The second thing Nathan did, after the paramedics arrived and while Carol was being assessed, was call a woman named Janet Pruitt at the Wyoming Division of Healthcare Financing. He had called her before, twice in the past year, trying to trace Medicaid placements under his mother's name. And she picked up with the careful attention of someone who had been expecting that this call would eventually come. He gave her the facility name, the county, the holding company registration, and the 6-month staff notation that a deputy had relayed to him in the first 20 minutes of the situation unfolding. Janet Pruitt said nothing for a moment. Then she said she needed to make some calls of her own and that Nathan should expect to hear from the State Inspector General's office before the week was out. The third thing Nathan did was call a lawyer in Cheyenne named Douglas Marsh, who had been recommended to him by his veteran service officer 8 months earlier, when Nathan had begun to suspect that wherever his mother was, the circumstances of her being there were not right. Douglas Marsh answered on the second ring. Nathan described what he was looking at. Marsh said he would file for emergency guardianship that afternoon and would have a cease and desist on the facility's Medicaid billing by the following morning. All of this took 90 minutes. Through all of it, Kodiak did not leave Carol's side. At one point, while Nathan was stepping away to take Marsh's call back, Carol Hayes leaned down and said something to Kodiak that Nathan didn't hear. The dog's tail moved, once, slowly, the way it moved when something had been recognized as safe. Carol put both hands on either side of Kodiak's face and looked at him directly, the way she used to look at her students when she wanted them to understand something, and nodded once, as if confirming something they had agreed on. Nathan watched this from 15 feet away and did not speak. Gregory Pell was at a county advisory board luncheon when the calls began reaching him. The first was from his facility administrator. The second was from his attorney. The third, which he did not take, was from a state inspector general's investigator. He left the luncheon early and drove directly to the facility, arriving 90 minutes after Nathan's calls had begun their work, and found 2 state agency vehicles already in the parking lot. He stood outside his own building for a moment looking at them. He was a man who had operated for 7 years in a space where the oversight was intermittent and the money was reliable, and the people in his care were not the kind of people whose families had the time or knowledge to push back effectively. Nathan Hayes had not been in that category, but Pell hadn't known that. He hadn't looked. Nathan drove to Borden County the next morning with Kodiak and his mother's winter coat. which he had kept folded in the hall closet for 14 months, because putting it away felt like a decision he wasn't ready to make. The discharge process took 3 hours. A state caseworker was present throughout and documented everything. When Carol Hayes walked out of Sunrise Residential Care's front entrance in her own coat, with her son's arm at her elbow and a German Shepherd at her left knee, the facility administrator stood at the door and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Pell's attorney had already called Marsh by then. The conversation had been brief and had not gone well for Pell's side. The Wyoming State Inspector General's investigation into Gregory Pell's Sunrise Residential Care concluded 4 months later, with findings of fraudulent Medicaid billing totaling $318,000 across multiple misidentified or incorrectly admitted residents over a 6-year period. Carol Hayes' case was the centerpiece. The civil suit, which Douglas Marsh filed with 3 co-plaintiffs, whose families had been located through the investigation, settled in mediation at a number that Marsh declined to publicize, but described to Nathan as appropriate. Pell surrendered his state care facility license in March. The Borden County Social Services contract was rebid for the first time in 7 years. Pell's name was removed from the advisory board the same week the investigation findings were released. His attorney issued a statement. Nobody read it. Carol Hayes moved back into the house in Hardin County in early December, 8 days after Nathan brought her home. A home health aide came 4 mornings a week. Nathan was there the other days. She had good mornings and harder mornings. And the good mornings were good in the specific way that things that nearly disappeared are good. Not taken for granted. Not assumed. She remembered the house completely. She remembered the bird feeders and had opinions about the sunflower seed situation, which Nathan addressed. She remembered lemon pound cake and made it at Christmas, sitting at the kitchen table and talking to Kodiak the entire time she worked, as though he were a student who needed to understand the importance of lemon zest and could be trusted to retain the lesson. She didn't always find Nathan's name on the first reach. Sometimes she would look at him across the table, and the name would take a moment to arrive. And in that moment, her face would do the thing he had learned to wait through, the reaching, the searching. And then it would settle, and she would say his name with the particular relief of someone who has found something in a place they had half feared it wasn't anymore. He was always still there. He always waited. Kodiak slept in the hallway outside Carol's room. Not instructed to. Not trained for it. Just there each night when Nathan checked, flat on the floor with his chin on his paws and his ears soft, keeping his own kind of watch. Sometimes miracles don't come from the direction you've been looking. Sometimes you spend 14 months facing a door that never opens, and the miracle comes in through a parking lot in November. Through a dog who makes a decision and sits down and will not be moved. And through a woman's hands that remember how to touch a dog even when she is reaching for everything else. God does not always end the searching on the day we feel we cannot search anymore. Sometimes He keeps one more door open just past the last one we expected, and places someone or something in front of it so we cannot walk past. Carol Hayes was 2 steps from that car door. 2 steps from driving away into a morning where her son might never have known she had been there. What stopped her had 4 legs and 87 pounds, and a scar on his foreleg, and had already decided, for reasons no one will ever fully explain, that this was not the moment to stand aside. If this story reached your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that the people we love are worth looking for. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever had a moment where a dog knew something before you did. We want to hear it. Your story might carry someone else through a long search of their own. If you believe in stories of loyalty, family, and the grace that finds us in the places we least expect, Please subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and bring home anyone you are still waiting for. Nathan had not spoken to his father's grave since he was 15 years old. He'd stopped because it had felt like a performance he wasn't interested in giving, and he had always preferred honesty to performance even when honesty was harder. But on a Sunday morning in February, 4 days after Carol made the lemon pound cake and 3 days after she called him by the wrong name and then found the right one, he drove the 8 miles to the county cemetery and stood at the flat granite marker in the frozen grass for a long time. Kodiak stood beside him. The morning was clear and sharp, and the Bighorn peaks to the west held snow that would not leave until May. He didn't rehearse what he was going to say. He didn't have to. He said, "I found her. She's home." Then he stood there in the silence for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. Kodiak sat in the grass beside him and tilted his face slightly into the wind that came down off the mountains, ears soft, present in the complete and uncomplicated way that dogs are present when they have decided the moment is worth staying in. Nathan looked at the mountains. He thought about a parking lot in November. He thought about a dog who had sat down in front of a car door for reasons that no training manual had specified and no order had commanded. He thought about his mother's hands moving across the dog's head with a familiarity that her memory could not have explained, but her hands had remembered anyway. Hands that had packed his lunch and signed his report cards and stood at a driveway and not cried until he turned the corner. Hands that had reached for his face when she could not find his name and held it there until she did. Some things go beyond what training produces. Some things go beyond what can be commanded. Some things, Nathan had come to believe, are simply what loyalty looks like when it is operating at its deepest register. Quiet and enormous and entirely without ceremony, asking for nothing, offering everything, standing between whoever needs standing between and wherever they might otherwise have gone. He drove home through the clean February morning with his window cracked an inch and Kodiak's ears moving in the cold air. His mother was in the kitchen when he got back. She was at the window, looking out at the bird feeders, and she had coffee in both hands and the precise expression of a woman who has strong opinions about the seed situation and is currently collecting evidence. She heard his boots on the porch and turned. This time his name came immediately.